Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. Last week, we spent our time developing the model for triangular trade, or models, within the colonial American economy. We looked at how sugar and rum propelled the English colonies to economic success. Although we're approaching the colonial development region by region, and we're in New England right now, this is a good time to work through how the African slave trade came to be so dominant in the southern colonies of England's North American colonial enterprise. As I mentioned last week, our springboard will be how slavery took hold in Carolina. Now, when we talk about Carolina from a mid-17th century vantage point, we're talking largely about today's North and South Carolina, as well as Georgia. What we've developed so far in the North has focused around the Puritans of New England. They first arrived in the area of Plymouth just after the native population had suffered a tremendous plague that had decimated many communities. The local natives were divided about how to deal with the English, but Massasoit and his Wampanoag tribe embraced them with friendship, and that allowed them to get a foothold. And the rest has been covered pretty well, how they grew that original foothold and multiplied their groups, their land, and consolidated their power, displacing the other local communities. They had encountered the Dutch and the French, but not in the immediate area. This was as good an opportunity as they could have hoped for. Not all regions were this way. And as we look to the advancement of English interests, as they spread out across the land, they did settle in areas that were already contested by other European nations, and Carolina was one of those areas. Now, we're going to be focusing on the European interest here, but bear in mind that Carolina was not a wasteland. In 1600, it's estimated that between 15 and 20,000 natives populated the landscape. And they represented three different groups. I mean, if we break it down linguistically, you have the Siouan group, which was spoken by the Catawbas. You have the Iroquoian, which is spoken by the Cherokee. And you have the Muskegon, which is spoken by the Creek. So at any rate, as we head south along the eastern seaboard, like our outline of Europe and New England, the goal is to set the stage for the arrival of the English. Here, like up north, they were late to the party, and just like up north, they would come to dominate the region. And for this reason, I think it's a good idea to sketch out the region from a European perspective. We'll cover the natives when we actually focus on the southern colonies. So the two main players were Spain and France, and there was a lot of activity. The Dutch were not much of a factor, neither were the Portuguese, and I'll explain. When we look at European colonialism, they could have been. So let's back up all the way to 1492. When Columbus landed at San Salvador, the world was forever changed. This was also the same year that Spain began in the modern sense. 1492 was the year that King Ferdinand of Aragon joined his kingdom with Queen Isabella of Castile. This new kingdom was plunged into war after war after war almost immediately, for a very long time. This represented one more of those paradigm shifts that changed the political and religious landscape across the European continent. We spent several episodes on this very early on in the series. The long and the short of it is that at that time, Spain and Portugal were fighting over who got what in the New World. There had been some attempt to moderate the dispute within Catholicism, and in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. This agreement, negotiated by the Pope Alexander IX, a Spaniard, basically split the New World in half, and I think Spain got the better deal. So, a long story short, the world was divided, and Spain's interests included the Caribbean, most of Central and South America, except Brazil, which was too far east and given to the Portuguese, and America. Their goal was gold and silver and spices. They had a very different vision of colonization than the English. Within 70 years, Spain had explored the areas from the USA down through Argentina. They wanted a passage to the Orient. Again, their goal for colonization was different than the mercantilism of England or that parallel Colbertism of France. The Spanish planned communities. They incorporated a legal code. There was no autonomy. The goal was money for the crown. So they claimed everything in the ground. The explorers were encouraged to find the treasures. Originally, they paid a tax of 20%, but that was eventually cut in half to 10%. And once a year, the treasure would be shipped back to Spain. So, in other words, from the perspective of the Spanish crown, it was kind of like, go explore and find the treasures of the earth. Extract them, give us our cut, and keep the rest. This setup led to a lot of activity all over the place. Their stronghold was Hispaniola. From there, they sent out the explorers. Spanish progress eventually led them up the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. They sailed north out of the Caribbean along the coast until about Carolina, and then they turned right and headed across the Atlantic for Spain. Florida was on the radar pretty early. Ponce de Leon tried to colonize Florida in 1521. He failed. 5 years later, in 1526, Vasquez de Ayllón, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce a few of these Spanish names, Vasquez de Ayllón, from Hispaniola, tried to settle Carolina with 500 settlers, and that was abandoned in 1527 after he died. In 1528, Panfilo de Narvaez left Cuba and landed at Tampa Bay, and from there he traveled north, and there was a lot of activity and a lot of failure. And then back to the Gulf Coast. He failed as well. What had begun as an army of 500 to 600 men would be a small band of 4, that's right, just 4 men, when it finally reached Mexico in the early 1530s. So in 1539, Hernando de Soto landed at Tampa Bay, and his journey would last 4 years. And this group would work their way through today's Georgia, both Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, and of course Florida. But he died in 1542. So remember, at this time, war was raging across Europe. These northern areas in today's mainland USA were expensive. They had not yielded huge deposits of minerals or gold or silver, so they became less attractive for the Spanish to explore. The Caribbean was taking off, and so was Mexico and South America. By 1561, now King Philip II of Spain, due to the expense of war, stopped the colonization of Florida for a year, only for a year. Because in 1562, French Huguenots under Jean Ribaut tried to colonize Fort Royal Sound. They failed, but they would try to colonize again, and this time it was in the Florida territory. So that little incursion did not sit well with Pedro Menendez de Avilés, who vowed to remove the French from the region. Again, these wars raging across the continent of Europe, and here's these French Huguenots setting up shop right next door to Spain and then right in Spain's claimed territory. So in 1565, he took 1,500 people, again, a full slice of society with all the artisans and specialists required to organize a self-sufficient community, and founded St. Augustine, as well as a bunch of outposts heading north into the Carolina area. And these would serve as outposts of security for the wayward, often pirated ships that were returning to Spain full of gold and silver. He crushed the Huguenots at Port Royal Sound, and renamed it San Mateo. It was actually kind of like payback. Ribaut had been attacking the Spanish outposts along the coast. He named the settlement Carolina after France's King Charles. Now, Carolina is Latin for Charles, and oddly enough, that name would eventually stick, even though the French would not. In 1629, when the English first laid claim to Carolina, Charles I of England kept the name in honor of himself. After the English settled the area, French Huguenots would again return and blend right in with the English. They had a lot in common. Remember, the Huguenots were Protestant. So anyway, with the destruction of the French settlement, any real or official French activity was ended. They were very busy in Canada. They followed the Mississippi River from north to south, with interests in Illinois and Ohio and Michigan. They did scuffle with Spain for those western territories, eventually settling the Louisiana Territory in 1673. And they would take Mobile Bay and Louisiana from Spain, and in 1718 they would settle New Orleans. but we'll get to all of those areas in due time. Well, Pedro Menendez de Avilés had hoped that St. Augustine would become the crown jewel of Spanish North America. It didn't. But it is recognized as the oldest European city in America. It was never quite self-sufficient. In fact, a year later, de Avilés relocated to the north at St. Helena, at Paris Island, or Fort Royal. It was recognized as part of Florida back then. But today, this site is in South Carolina. And again, this was a strategic location to help guard the ships heading to Spain. The focus was still Florida, the Caribbean, and South America. So, okay, back to Pedro Menendez de Avilés. The big deal here is that in 1568, 2 years later, Spain invaded the Netherlands. We talked a lot about this early on, so to keep this moving along, basically that changed the focus in the New World. That invasion led to 80 years of warfare on the European continent. These wars saw ever-shifting alliances and ended in 1648 at the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, with a very different world and the rise of the modern nation-state. So there was a foothold in Carolina, but in 1585, because of the wars and Elizabeth's indifference or encouragement to the piracy that was going on, depending on what source you read, Sir Francis Drake destroyed St. Augustine. He burned it. War was expensive. Spain did not invest a whole lot in Carolina, especially after that. What they did contribute to the colonization of America was the most complete set of maps and exploration of the whole area. And that information was soon available to all of Europe. And that explains why so many places around the region in the South today still bear Spanish names. So during this time, there had been Spanish Jesuits also that had traveled as far north as Chesapeake Bay. They were operating these little agricultural outposts for the sake of missions. But there was really no interest in pursuing these northern areas because there wasn't any gold. The French were sniffing around, but the Spanish outpost at Elena prevented them from really gaining a foothold in Carolina. So when Drake burned St. Augustine, the folks that had traveled north were forced to head back south. They'd returned in a few decades, but had left the area for quite a while. And here's where it gets kind of interesting to me. With the Spanish out of the way in 1608, a little further north of Carolina, they settled a colony of their own, the English that is, and they called it Jamestown. The Spanish did return and took control of the area in the early decades of the 17th century, and that lasted until 1670 when the English settled Charlestown. And Carolina at this time has been called the debatable land or the unsettled land, that time between, 1608 and 1670, somewhere in there. And here is where we can now return our focus on the English settlement of Carolina. You see what we've done. We've developed the geopolitical landscape of the English colonial South. From this quick overview, we understand how Jamestown came to be settled, why it was allowed to be settled when the French weren't allowed in the area. I mean, the French had gotten slapped. When the English arrived, the area had been temporarily all but abandoned by the Spanish. The door had been left open. And by the time the Spanish had come back to Carolina, the English were already setting up shop just to the north. They kind of slid right in there. So this whole conversation started with Barbados. Let's return there. Without the burgeoning colonial activity in Barbados and the hiatus that the Spanish had taken, the English may never have pulled the next stunt. I mean, they had Jamestown, but to enter no man's land where Spain had laid claim was a whole new ballgame. Barbados, you recall, had been uninhabited when the English arrived in 1627. They had tried tobacco and it failed. They had tried cotton and that failed. But historian Paul Johnson lays out the whole thing pretty well. He kind of lays it out this way. Again, the English arrived in Barbados in 1627, but during the years of the English Civil War, there came Puritan refugees, along with Anglicans. They had money, but no real agricultural success with, again, the tobacco or the cotton. And at the same time, the Dutch colonies in Brazil were being harassed by the Portuguese. So they fled to Barbados with their like-minded English friends. Remember, these guys got along pretty well for a while. The Puritans had money and the Dutch didn't. But they did have a developed expertise in the sugar market. And what wonderful partners they were about to make. The settlement of Barbados took off. Its population outgrew its agricultural space. So everybody thought. By the time the Stuart dynasty was restored with Charles II in 1660, the island boasted 55,000 people. Bridgetown, the capital, had 400 households. The island itself hosted 175 big plantations. There were almost 200 middle-sized and about 1,000 smaller farms. There were 13,000 freemen, 2,300 indentured servants, and get this, a whopping 40,000 slaves. It's quite a colony for just 40 years. Again, I can't help but to wonder what England would have looked like had all of the Puritans, the money, the energy, the bodies, stayed and fought the Civil War. I mean, the history of the modern world might have looked very different. Between New England and the Caribbean, all of the Puritan, again, money, time, energy, bodies that left the country. Anyway, Barbados was the richest colony on the continent. In fact, their exports exceeded everyone else's combined. That's quite a jewel. But there was one problem. The ever-growing farms and population began to crowd the island. So, like I said, the first English claim to Carolina had come in 1629, before the Civil War. Charles's father, Charles I, had claimed it, and it had failed. And then, again, the Civil War came, as well as the 30 Years' War during that time. So maybe the English, like the Spanish, had been a little preoccupied before the 1660s. Maybe they'd been a little fatigued or stretched a little thin. Well, with the overcrowding on Barbados and the success, Charles wanted to alleviate the congestion. And when he scanned the landscape, he noticed that he had Jamestown on the Chesapeake, and the colonies north of there were more friendly. I mean, he was in a process of grabbing New Netherland, and New Sweden wouldn't be far behind, so might as well try for more of the coast. I mean, the French were in the west of the Appalachian Mountains. They were in Canada. So Charles II was pretty ambitious. He would boot the Dutch and the Swedes out of the mid-Atlantic region, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey. He was busy. He was bold. He had as big a stomach as he had eyes. He was about to virtually secure the eastern seaboard, except for Florida. So in 1663, he gave the Carolinas, area that we know as the Carolinas, to a group of 8 men to alleviate the overcrowding in Barbados. And there were invites to Jamestown and New England as well. I mean, let's settle that naked land. Screw Spain. So the guys that had received the charter from Charles finally settled Charlestown in 1670. They brought the Barbados guys in with a vision for full-blown feudalism, which was ignored by the Barbados plantation workers. In fact, there were a lot of differences between the owners and the plantation workers. The guys doing the work or overseeing the work located the best land for sugar and set up shop. All these plantation crops, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, required specific soils and climates. So the proprietors wanted freedom of religion to attract as many settlers as possible. The Barbadian planters were Anglican. They made it hard for non-Anglicans. The owners did not like slavery. The planters demanded it. They were setting up the same system that had allowed Barbados to excel. You see where this attitude would eventually take them. The revolution, and then these guys, their progeny, would one day be the heart and soul of the rebellion that was the Civil War. The system was almost feudal. Again, Puritans like Lord Seal and Say, as well as the Anglicans like Ferdinand Gorges, were all pretty keen on feudalism as an economic model. As we've discussed, as we've seen, slavery was a growing industry. New England had embraced the supporting role. With the transfer of Barbadian planters and the large-scale plantation farming, another market for slaves began to emerge. It was about this time that the life of a slave in the colonies began to steadily decline. So around the same time, 2 years after, Charles had gifted Carolina to Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon, and 7 other nobles to establish Carolina from the Atlantic to the Pacific. African service was made permanent. Quote, Negroes and other slaves who were incapable of making satisfaction by addition of time, end quote. And by the way, any black person without documentation was considered a slave, as were their children. That's pretty brutal in and of itself. Anyway, This was a bold move by Charles and the Englishmen that settled the area. There was a lot of controversy both within the English camp and with Spain over this colony. The first permanent settlement was at Albemarle Point in 1670. This was the same year that they signed the Treaty of Madrid. This was a significant treaty for both the English and the Spanish. It officially ended a war that had begun in 1654 and saw the English conquer Jamaica. In this treaty, Spain acknowledged England's claims to the North American theater. I mean, that's a big deal. Until this time, Spain had only recognized the Treaty of Tordesillas from so long before. The one provision that we should mention here is that, according to this treaty, the English in Carolina were to be confined to what they had, no expansion. Now, judging by previous actions of the English colonizers, how do you think that agreement went? You're right, they didn't pay any attention to it. There were battles fought for years. But by 1686, the English had successfully pushed the Spanish back considerably. Those conflicts would persist throughout the 18th century, coinciding with the Great Wars of Europe, including the American Revolution, by the way. So, at any rate, a few years later in 1680, they relocated that first settlement to what became officially Charlestown. The controversy from within the English camp was primarily between the lords proprietors and the planters they brought from Barbados. Even though the proprietors of Carolina did not want slavery, the planters were quick and effective to organize. They made sure that only those who would sympathize with their views on the subject would be elected to offices. Not only did they ignore their bosses, they went a step farther than even the New England colonies had, a step farther than Charles himself had desired. They enslaved natives as well. Charles had admired the natives. He had admired the Narragansetts, you remember? They had pledged their loyalty to the crown. He wanted to remain friendly with the natives. But he was over there in England, and they were over here in America, and there was money to be made, and an entire culture emerged that was contrary to everybody's expectation. Everybody else's that was not there, but the same people that would reap the profits. There was success, but also slower coastal growth into the early decades of the 18th century. There were tough times, to be sure. And in 1719, the colony was transferred from a proprietary colony to a royal colony. And in 1729, the colony was split into two parts, north and south. And 2 years later, in 1731, Georgia was carved out of South Carolina. The real population explosion would be a few decades away when the Scotch-Irish, primarily from Pennsylvania, would lead the way. Even though the settlement seemed to go pretty smooth, all in all. Like the northern colonies, the issue of hard currency would persist throughout the 18th century. And here is where the Spanish influence and presence would be recognized for a long time, in a very practical way. Popular Spanish coins made of silver, called pieces of 8, would be circulated as currency in the area. It was actually recognized as legal tender until 1857. And how's that grab you? One might think that that would wholly undermine the official currency of the United States of America, the one issued by Congress. But like so many weird situations in history, it was to the expediency of the young nation to allow for the currency that was available to be used in the absence of the official, kind of like wampum had been a little while earlier. One last thing before we go today. We've talked a lot about Spain, more than ever. Actually, as far as the colonization of North America goes, we've talked about Florida. I think the backstory of Carolina is important for context. But it also opens the door for one more point that I want to make. And it's an interesting one that includes all three major players from our narrative today, England and Spain, and then a little bit of France on the side. So as we've noted, there was a lot of interaction and tension between these three for centuries. And in the end, England would secure the East Coast, the Spanish Florida, and Central and South America. The French would secure Canada for a while, and the Mississippi River north to south, and Illinois and Michigan, Ohio. There would be conflict around the Gulf Coast states, the land changing hands several times over in some cases, including Louisiana. But a notable area is often left out of the equation. It's left out of the conversation. at least from what I recognize. I didn't grow up in Florida or in the Deep South, so I don't know if that's, common conversation in those areas, but up here in the Northeast, it's not. And that pertains to Florida being such a contested region. During the French and Indian War, which was just, one theater in a worldwide war, England had taken both Cuba and the Philippines from Spain. These were valuable colonies. So in 1763, at the close of the war, the Treaty of Paris returned Cuba and the Philippines to Spain. England received compensation, however. Florida. From 1763 to 1784, Florida was an English colony. Well, from 1763 to 1784, Florida represented two English colonies, East Florida and West Florida. England had split the colony in half to better govern it. And these were royal colonies with, assigned governors. There was a lot of tension and a lot of land for the crown to protect in the New World. So in the same year that England acquired Florida, they issued the Proclamation of 1763. And this basically forbade English settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Really what it said was you shouldn't do it, and we're not going to protect you or come to your aid if you do. It was to placate the natives. It would ease tension with the French. It irritated a lot of colonials right up to the time of the Revolution. This is one of the craws that got under George Washington's skin. They offered strong inducements by way of land grants to encourage permanent English settlement in Florida. They allowed for slavery to encourage Southern settlers to relocate as well. We often think of the American Revolution as the rebellion of the 13 American colonies. But in reality, England had, maybe 20 colonies in North America at the time, and Florida accounted for 2 of those. Did you know that Florida was representing 2 English colonies at the time of the Revolution? It's weird to think that they didn't participate in the Revolution. They didn't break away with the other 13. They were happy under English rule. Probably felt a lot better than that oppressive Spanish rule. But I find it easy to dismiss the Caribbean colonies, not participating. But Florida, they're connected. They just seem like they belonged to the other 13 or with the other 13. But in 1784, England lost that area again. And this would continue to be a sore spot and an area of real tension for decades. Andrew Jackson would invade Florida, quite a few years later. But those are all stories for another day. And until then, I hope our time together this day has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.